Should I share?
Yeah, go ahead. Well, just wait a few seconds. I just want to welcome those of you who are new to BAC. We meet here every Monday at noon in Haynes Hall Reading Room and also via Zoom, at least during this pandemic phase. So this talk will be an hour long, followed by 30 minutes of questions. And those of you who are on Zoom, please enter your question in the chat, and then we'll either let Amy decide who she wants to answer questions for, or you can delegate me to pick. And priority to people who are in the room for questions. So next week, Dr. Kim Hill will talk from ASU, and his talk will be entitled Human Uniqueness and the Study of Interdependence in Samal Sea Nomads of the Philippines. And then the next two talks will be from the Max Planck Institute. Laurel Fogarty, who's a wonderful modeler in the cultural evolution world, will give a talk called Cultural Rescue, Avoiding Extinction with Gene Culture Coevolution. And then Carolyn Schupley from Max Planck, the one in Constance, will talk about skill acquisition and life history towards a better understanding of cognitive evolution. And that will be based mainly on her empirical data on orangutans. So if you want to see the full list, please visit our website. We will hopefully at the end of the week have next quarter's talks announced. Thank you to our funding from the UCLA Dean of Social Scientists and also the Department of Anthropology, Department of Communication, and private donors. And today we're really happy to have Amy Liu here from Stony Brook. She studied many different species and is going to talk about geladas today, female counter-strategies to infanticide in lactating gelada females, adaptive but not cost-free. And you'll find a link to her website on the BEC website if you want to follow up on her other projects as well. Please join me in welcoming Amy. And yes, please do share your screen now.
Okay, thanks, Susan, for that introduction, and thank you so much for having me here today. So today I'm going to do, this is a very common for me where I give a talk about data that's not published yet. That's what I generally like to do instead of talking about what's already been published, because I think, let's generate some conversation and some ideas that I can integrate. So, it's a little selfish and a little just because I get bored of stuff that's already been out. So today I'm going to talk about lactating female geladas and the things they do to sort of mitigate and prevent infanticide. And I want to start by, Susan asked me to give a general introduction of what I do, because I tend to talk about geladas and infanticide risk a lot, because in terms of field work, that seems to be the primary topic that keeps hitting me in the head over and over again. We were just talking before this talk that, it seems like whenever I try to pivot and not study infanticide risk and geladas, I try to analyze some data and the data tell me that it's infanticide again. So, but I do a lot of different things. So the primary focus of my research, I guess I would call myself a primate behavioral ecologist. However, I'm interested in a lot more than just behavior. So I generally look at ecological and social challenges in the environment, how that impacts animal physiology and behavior. And then, in addition, how those behaviors and that physiology is mediated by various proximate mechanisms like hormones, immune biomarkers, gut microbiome, and then how kind of the interplay between those mechanisms and the things that they're meant to do adaptively or in terms of regulating trade-offs influences life history development and fitness. So that's the overarching theme. I publish a lot of papers on mechanisms, but I really only care about mechanisms so much that they inform us about fitness components or life history components. So today I'm going to bypass those mechanisms and really talk about these female geladas, right? And the pressures on female gelada fitness. And I want to start by really talking about how if you grow up trained as a primate behavioral ecologist, one of the first things you learn in class is that their primate females as mammals, their fitness is limited by food and energy, right? So because mammalian reproduction is so costly, right? What is it? They say that, the average cost of pregnancy for a human female is about 400 calories a day. For lactation, it's about 600 calories a day. So that's like running for 60 minutes every day. So it's costly. And so, your fitness is limited. So the number of offspring you have And there in the right there, I have a couple of baby geladas there, is going to be limited by food, energy, and time, right? And so I've been really interested in how aspects of social living influence access to food and energy. And again, historically, when we've been interested in female fitness and sociality, everybody's focused on social status, group size, variables related to competition, right? So how does dominance rank predict how many offspring you have, how much food you get, et cetera, et cetera. And I would argue that while those factors certainly influence fitness incrementally, right? You might have one or two more offspring in a lifetime if you're high ranking. I would say there are pressures that some primates face that are a lot more costly than being a female in a large group facing many competitors, or a female who's low ranking that can't outcompete her higher ranking group mates. And that pressure comes from intersexual conflict, right? So intersexual conflict describes situations where the fitness interests of males and females collide. So again, if you think about females, right, because of how costly reproduction is, females are limited by food and energy, whereas males are typically limited by mating, right? Because every mating event that a male engages in, assuming it's with a different female at a different time, can result in more reproductive success for a female, right? She's not going to necessarily have more offspring by mating more. And so this sets up an intersexual conflict of interest where what's best for the male's reproductive success may not be best for the female. And this conflict of interest, has shaped male and female reproductive strategies across many different animals. And in its extreme form, we have what's been termed sexually selected infanticide. And this is a phenomenon described by Sarah Hrdy in the 1970s, where she observed in Hahnemann langurs that males kill unrelated dependent infants, that this accelerated a female's resumption of cycling. And this was beneficial to the male because it allowed him to mate sooner with a female than he otherwise would have, right? Because lactating females are often kind of out of reproductive running, right? And so this was adaptive. And despite, many years of debate over the adaptive value of this behavior, here we are, like, wow, we're like 50 years later now. And we know that sexually selected infanticide exists in a number of different primate species. And not only that, it exists in, horses and various other groups. Okay, so this is a big cost to the female, right? Because for every time this happens, the loss is one offspring. It's not that offspring, gets reproduced slower, right? Develops slower, right? It's literally that, if the rate of infanticide is really high, it's death. Okay, so I would argue that this is quite a much bigger challenge for females to face than just being low ranking or being in a large group. And I want to talk about that historically, when we thought about infanticide risk, we started off by thinking about whether this is a male strategy that's adaptive. And we've thought about it a lot in the last 30 years in terms of females and what they do, right? So there's quite a bit of literature on female counterstrategies. So what do females do, since it's so costly, to kind of mitigate or prevent infanticide? And then what are the costs of females, right? How much does infanticide actually cost them, how in terms of their overall fitness? But I would argue that there are aspects of this, at least when I started my faculty position at Stony Brook, that really haven't been tackled, right? And from the female's perspective, there are two things. We've really described what females do, but rarely has a paper looked at whether that behavior that a female performs in order to what we think is preventing infanticide or reducing the cost, are they actually adaptive? And we haven't had that because it's hard to link these kind of rare events, right, to fitness outcomes. And then do they have costs, right? So when females decide to alter their reproductive patterns or to alter their behavior, right, does that strategy have a cost in and of itself, and what are they? And then from the baby's perspective, we focused on, yeah, okay, they could die, but in many primate species, the rate of infanticide following some sort of event, usually it's the immigration of a new male into a group, or the ascension of a male to high dominance rank, that when these events happen, infanticide rates go up, but a good proportion of those infants do not die. And so what happens to them, right? Because this is an event that is highly stressful. We know that in geladas. I'll show you some data showing glucocorticoid concentrations in group individuals. But what happens, what does this do in terms of, is it a source of adversity during early life? And those are questions that we're trying to answer currently and in the next probably decade. So if I go back to that big bubble of, what I'm interested in, right? In terms of that social or ecological challenge, I keep going back to infanticide risk, because for the species that I study, that seems to be one of the most the most important factors that influences these females. And that species that I study are geladas, and geladas are circumventicine primates, so they're closely related to baboons. They're endemic to Ethiopia, and people who study, primate evolution, they're kind of known for focusing their diet on grass and their social structure, which they live in these large bands, so multiple core reproductive units grouped together in bands of 200 to 300, sometimes 600 individuals. And like female baboons, if you know anything about female baboon society, the females form matrilineal social hierarchies. And all of these things are interesting, but what I find the most interesting are this social structure, which actually, other than giving you a very large sample size, is kind of like, it sets up the perfect storm for sexually selected infanticide. So these are just some depictions of gelada reproductive units. Some people call them groups. I don't know why those of us that study geladas call them units. It's just sort of happened historically. But here are a bunch of units. So as you can see, this unit has a bunch of females and a male. This unit has a bunch of females and 2 males. So gelada society is structured so that usually there's one breeding male. Sometimes he's the only male. Sometimes there is a follower male. That follower male rarely gets reproductive opportunities. He is most often the former leader of that unit, so the former reproductive male. And outside of those 1 or 2 males, there's usually between 2 and 10 females. The largest group we've seen is 13 females. So they kind of, all of these units coexist. So I'll show you pictures, they kind of just look like one group of 300 individuals, unless you can distinguish those core units. And they are embedded in that band, right? Which means that we can study so many individuals at once. And then outside of those reproductive units, when males mature, they disperse into bachelor groups. Bachelor groups are all male groups. They generally have no reproductive opportunities. Every once in a while, we've seen a bachelor male sort of mate with an adolescent female who's not traveling, keeping up with her unit. But bachelor males effectively don't really have reproductive opportunities until one of them challenges a leader male, overthrows him, and takes over the unit. And in this situation, we call these takeover events. And in the immediate aftermath of a takeover, so 3 months, 6 months, what we see is 30 to 40% of infants are lost to infanticide. So we see this immediate spike. It's actually decreased in the last decade. The number used to be 40 to 50%, but it's still pretty high. So if we look at this, takeovers are generally, these male immigration events. If you study any other species, well, even if you study geladas, they're rare. They occur about once every 2 years on average, okay? But because there are so many groups, so in one single band, we can follow 20 different reproductive units. You follow enough units, and over the course of 10, 20, 30 years, actually, we're in year, what year are we in right now? We're in year 17. You can get enough data potentially to answer some questions about takeovers quantitatively. So this is one of their, so geladas, they eat grass, they live on the plateau. So what you see in the background there is the end of that plateau. So the plateau drops down to a cliff. That's where they usually sleep, and they'll wake up and crawl up in the morning. And this is, we call it social hour, where you can literally see all the units at the same time. So you can see there's one there, there's kind of one there. And then we can just go around and pick a unit to follow. And so because that's what it looks like, we can amass quite a bit of data. So this is where we are, Simien Mountains National Park in northern Ethiopia. These are my co-directors. So Jacinta Biener and Tori Bergman, they founded the site in 2005, and Noah Snyder-Mackler and I joined in 2011. So we've sort of been co-directing together for a decade now, which is quite a long time. Here we are again. As you can see, geladas are, one thing I didn't mention about them is they're high altitude animals. So this is us. We're about 11,000 feet up, and we're looking down at the clouds over there. So we're pretty high up. Well, just to give you a sense of where we are. Okay, so for many, many years, we've thought about infanticide risk. And we also started off by thinking about female counter strategies. But in the last, I would say 6-7 years, we've gone a lot pretty far beyond that. So if we look at male takeovers as a threat to geladas, and we take this dotted line and think about this as the life course of a gelada, we know a lot of things about takeovers now. We know that takeovers are basically the most important factor structuring infant mortality, influencing infant mortality. Okay, so gelada infant mortality is actually pretty low, but takeovers drive almost all of it. Okay, so infanticide happens, and that was documented pretty early on. We know for juvenile females that males that come into the unit, they actually can accelerate the pace at which a female can mature. So females actually synchronize their maturations, which we know from this. So gelada females have this this patch of skin on their chest, which does not have fur. And that chest is a sexual signal for adult females. For a young gelada female with her first, what we call sexual swelling. So this is a swelling in geladas. I know baboons have them on their perineal region, but this entire chest region kind of gets puffy, and we know that's related to the surge in estrogens during adolescence. So this is our marker for maturation, and this is a female's first maturation is synchronized to those male takeovers, and I'll talk about that a little bit briefly. And we know that for adult females, there are a number of counter strategies, but the big one that we published on is that pregnant female geladas, if they're pregnant at the time of a takeover, will lose their offspring. And this is not caused by male aggression. We documented these pregnancy losses hormonally, and the background rate of pregnancy loss in the population was 1 out of 50, I believe, and the rate following an infanticide, following a takeover, was 8 out of 10. Okay, so there's quite of a dramatic difference there. And then on top of that, we know from our pattern of injuries that we extracted from the population that in the immediate months following a takeover, the injury rates in groups go up. And this is especially the case for infants, even those who don't die, and also adult females, even those who don't lose their infants. And we know that adult females who suffer injuries but still keep their infants, their next birth is actually delayed, presumably as a consequence of that injury. We also know that all individuals, so I'm showing adult females here, that in the month following the takeover, they have a rise in fecal glucocorticoids, our proxy of stress physiology here. And this is unpublished, but we know that juveniles are affected. Pretty much everybody in that natal group is affected. Everybody experiences a rise in glucocorticoids. And then finally, we know that females in large groups are the most vulnerable to takeovers, okay? Probably because larger groups with more females are more attractive targets. And I just want to take that relationship with group size and briefly demonstrate to you a situation where we really wanted to talk about something other than takeovers, and yet the geladas drove us back to takeovers. So this was our paper recently in 2021 on male-mediated maturation in geladas, and real briefly, we found that male takeovers predicted the timing of females maturing. It also accelerated female maturation. So females who experienced a takeover and showed that first sexual swelling within months after that, they matured earlier on average than those in the rest of the population. Even more strikingly, we looked at fecal hormones and found that females in all age groups, so females generally mature when they're around 4, sometimes around 3, but you can see that even 1-year-olds, 2-year-olds, they're all responding to that takeover with a rise in fecal estrogens. It's just that some of them seem to be ready to mature and some of them are not. Some of them just experience this brief rise and then it goes away. So that was a story on takeover. So we're like, great, we've got that story taken care of. Let's control for takeovers and look at some variables that are classically more related to food and female competition. So we decided to look at dominance rank and group size. Dominance rank, we found the predicted effect where females that were high ranking, their daughters matured earlier. But this was the data for small versus large units. So as you can see here, at the survival curve here, daughters in large units, they matured quicker than daughters in smaller units. And this was a surprising result to us because almost all the data on group size related competition in primates and developmental pace suggests that individuals experience more competition in larger groups. So therefore, they should be maturing later, right? They should take longer because development, like reproduction, takes energy. And we didn't find that. And in geladas, they eat grass. So there's really no intergroup contest competition. There's not really displacement of units over sort of these prize food resources. And so we realized then that we had just published a paper, right, that I just showed you earlier, where large groups are more vulnerable to takeovers. And actually, when you look at unit size on the x-axis here and the probability of experiencing a takeover on the y-axis, you see that the likelihood when you're 3.5, which is about the age that a female would mature, of her experiencing a takeover at this time increases, right? The larger of a group she lives in. And so we think, at least what we wrote in the paper, that the most plausible scenario is that this early maturation is related to group size. And tentatively, our hypothesis is that this is related to maybe male challenges that aren't recorded as takeovers that happen maybe when we're not there or early in the morning. And so if large groups are kind of getting targeted more, then maybe there's just more basher males around and we're not kind of taking that effect into account when we just look at the data on actual takeovers. But anyway, there's an example where, everything sort of leads us back to takeovers and infanticide risk. But what I want to focus on today is a story for lactating females. And I think lactating females are really interesting in this takeover infanticide related context, because lactating females are the ones with the vulnerable infants, right? They're the infants that are preventing the males from reproducing. And a lactating female, has a few options. One of the options is to accelerate weaning. And another option that's been described is to produce deceptive signals of fertility to trick the male into thinking she's fertile when she's actually not. And so what I wanted to know, I find these strategies interesting because I never really bought that you can deceive signals of fertility. I think that because of some trade-offs between investing in offspring and investing in reproduction, that physiologically, maybe this is very difficult. And then secondly, I'm interested in whether those female reproductive strategies are costly, right? So let's say this works and your offspring survives. Does it have ramifications for that offspring later in life? So that's kind of why I'm interested in lactating females. So we already knew in geladas by 2018 that the resumption of cycling for adult females is linked to the timing of takeovers, just like that first adolescent swelling for juvenile females. And just to show you here, right, this is a gelada female. This is, a picture of intersexual conflict. This is an infant that's died from infanticide. And here is that chest area again of an adult female. So you can already see that this looks very different from the adolescent female. There's this hourglass of beads, and for lactating females, their chest does not look like this. The beads are all kind of deflated, and you can tell that they're lactating, in other words. And then usually when they resume cycling, these beads kind of swell up again, as you can see here, and we're able to tell, right, that they're fertile, even if we don't look at the hormones. Okay, so again, if we look at these guys, there are these two strategies. So you can maybe fake this swelling, or that swelling could be real, and this could reflect some sort of accelerated weaning, which we would hypothesize, if it's accelerated weaning, that it would also accelerate a female's next birth, right? Because that's the whole kind of point for the male, right? To accelerate everything. So those are the questions that I want to tackle today. So I just want to highlight that this is a question that we've thought about for over a decade. It started with Ayla Roberts when she was a graduate student in Michigan. Jacinta is her advisor. Jacinta's been thinking about it for a long time. And I've been working with Sophia Carrera, who's a graduate student in Michigan, and then Elise Baniel, who's my postdoc, on looking at this data recently. So the first thing I want to show you is the resumption of cycling. So we're looking at this in terms of when a female displays her first postpartum sexual swelling, okay? And we're looking at this swelling in the 3 months following a takeover. And in this case, we're looking at whether a takeover occurred before a swelling and how long it took, right, for the female to resume cycling, essentially, or resume some signal of cycling. And what you see is that in the takeover situation, right, females are accelerating their resumption of that first sex skin swelling. And if you look at the infant's age at takeover, what you see is that the earlier the takeover occurs in the infant's life, the faster that resumption of swelling is. So there's just kind of this nice linear relationship here. Okay, so that's the first piece of evidence. So then we wanted to know, is this a true indicator of fertility? So the way we tested this is we wanted to know if that accelerated swelling resulted in an accelerated interbirth interval. And the idea here is that a female would take just as long to conceive, right, as she would normally. And so as a result of this acceleration in the resumption of a cycling or swelling, right, the overall time frame, her reproductive pace would be accelerated. Do we see that? So the first thing that I want to show you is that, can you see this? The time to conceive actually increases in a takeover situation. So a female is now taking almost 8 months to conceive rather than about 5 months. So this is already suggesting to us that maybe this swelling is not not a normal swelling. And then if we look at the interbirth interval, it gets interesting. Okay, so if you look at the interbirth interval of everybody clumped together, in the takeover situation and the non-takeover situation, the interbirth interval is basically identical. Okay, but then if you look at the age at takeover relative to that interbirth interval, you see that in the infants that experience a takeover very early on, right, that interbirth interval is indeed accelerated. But when they experience a takeover later, like around 12 to 18 months, so closer to weaning, they don't really have an acceleration in their interbirth interval. So what this is telling us is that it's a little strange, right? It seems to, for a subset of these females, they seem to be able to get away with this. And maybe it's not, a perfect, honest indicator of fertility, but they're getting away with it. And for these younger females, there is obviously a cost. So what I'm trying to say is, depending on where a female is in lactation, right, the production of that signal seems to be seems to change her physiology in some way as to sometimes accelerate her interbirth interval. So then we wanted to ask, does the accelerated weaning or whatever this is, right? Does it work, right? So the big question is, does it actually increase infant survival? And we've looked at this in a number of ways. So here we ran a Cox proportional hazard model, right, that takes infant age into account. And we looked at this interaction effect between takeover period, right? So infants are going to be more likely to die during the immediate months following a takeover period. And then whether there's an interaction effect between takeover period and their mom's swelling or not. And it turns out there is. And this is just the data showing you that when a mom swells within 3 months of a takeover, right, she is more likely to have, sorry, this is reverse. She is more likely to have infants that survive. Sorry about that. I had to code them because we had zeros and ones there, which was not intuitive, but now I've made it more convincing, but less convincing, sorry. But what I'm trying to say is that the strategy appears to work. But it is, again, more complicated than that. So here I have a plot that actually I made years ago, and this kind of drove me to think about these ideas. So on the x-axis here is the age of the infant at the takeover. And on the y-axis here is the number of months it actually takes for the mom to actually resume swelling. So not all of them are resuming their swelling within 3 months, okay? And what you can see here is that for those females with young infants at the time of the takeover, some of them are constrained, right? They don't seem to be able to produce that swelling right away. Whereas the females with older infants, they're able to just, boom, produce it right after the takeover. So there seems to be a physiological constraint there. And here is, I apologize for this image. I just got this from my postdoc. I'm going to walk you through it. So there's an uneven number of bars here. So this is infant survival to 18 months on the y-axis. The bars are cases where females, moms swelled and moms did not, and in orange, they did not swell. So blue is swell, oranges did not swell. And on the bottom here are infant ages. So this is 0 to 6 months, 6 to 12 months, and this is older than 12 months. Okay, and I don't have an orange bar here because in the older to 12-month category, all the moms, or pretty much most of the moms, swelled. Okay, so what you see here is that there is a relationship that across age groups, females that swell are more likely to have infants that survive. Okay, but you'll note from these numbers, right, that fewer of them swell when those infants are young. Okay, and then just to break this smaller group down into 0 to 3 months, and I apologize here because the colors are reversed, but the point is, at the earliest age group, 0 to 3 months, the sample sizes are, yes, small, but there's kind of no difference. And so there are compounding effects here. The swelling is doing something, but also infants that are younger at a takeover seem to just be more likely to die. Okay, so lots of different things happening here. So in answer to some of these questions, right, do we have any evidence of deceptive fertility? So sort of, I mean, usually for many females, it doesn't seem to impact their IBI. They take longer to conceive, right? So it appears that for at least females that have older infants at the time of takeover, it can be deceptive and it can work, right? And it improves infant survival. But there's also evidence for accelerated weaning. Mothers with young infants seem to have a shortened IBI as a result of swelling, and they also appear to be constrained, right? So if you remember this figure, right? So females that have infants that are younger at the time of takeover, their IBIs are accelerated, their interbirth intervals are accelerated. And mothers with young infants, again, seem to have a harder time producing a swelling right away. And so for this subset of these females with younger infants, this is a complicated situation because their infants are highly vulnerable because they're young, And the strategy that appears to work is hardest to produce. And they have the most to pay potentially because the fact that the interbirth interval is accelerated suggests that they're investing less in that current infant, right? So those infants later on are the infants that we'd want to look at in terms of, compromises in their later life development. Okay, how are we doing on time? Okay, so while we were addressing the sort of immediate impact of a takeover on lactating females, we decided, well, let's look at that group size thing again, right? Because the last time we looked at group size, things pointed to takeovers again. So Sophia's been doing this as part of her dissertation. So we had Sophia actually remove all of the takeover related data. And we wanted her to look at resumption of cycling or the resumption of that first swelling and interbirth interval in the data where females never experience a takeover. And we wanted her to look at dominance rank and group size. But I'm going to show you the group size results here. So just to remind you, females in large groups are the most vulnerable to takeovers. And so what you see here is that just like what we saw with male-mediated maturation, adult females in large groups produce their swellings earlier than those in small and medium-sized groups. And this is in the total absence of takeovers. Their time from birth to their first sign of resumption of cycling is just shorter. The data are smaller here, like we have a much smaller sample size, particularly for large groups, but it seems like their time to conceive is not affected as much, although again, the sample size for large groups is fairly small, so I wouldn't say anything conclusive yet. And then their interbirth intervals are unaffected, but you still see this, effect on those adult females in terms of that first swelling, right? So it seems as if there's something with group size where the females are tuning in on some signal. Okay, so where do we go from now from here? We want to look at the cost for infants, which we've tried to look at for the last 3 or 4 years or 5 years, but we've had a difficult time because you really need lots of good data on infants during development, and with COVID and with various evacuations we've had in Ethiopia due to political unrest, we just haven't really had good post-takeover data. But we've been looking at the microbiome development, and we've been looking at growth. So those are the things that we want to examine in the next 10 years, in addition to, demographic measures of life history, right, that we can rely upon. And then the other question which we're tackling now is, given how costly some of these female reproductive strategies are, like accelerated weaning, like the Bruce effect, are there other sort of cheaper strategies that can keep these infants safe? And my graduate student, Jacob Vader, is starting to look at this by looking at female-female and male-male relationships and how they influence infant mortality, infant survival, juvenile mortality, juvenile survival. And I just want to show you some of the data that he's come up with. This is also unpublished and new. He just presented this at a recent meetings. So Jacob is interested in how female-female social relationships influence offspring survival overall. So he looked at it in the context of takeovers and outside the context of takeovers. So in dark blue here are females with strong same-sex relationships, and in light blue are those with weak. And what he found, which was really interesting, was that female-female relationships, or the strength of those relationships, didn't have an effect on infant mortality or infant survival in kind of that baseline situation where we don't think about takeovers. In the takeover situation, though, females with stronger relationships with other females had better infant survival, but it's not really infants, okay? It's offspring survival. And when you look at this line, it separates at about 1.5 years of age, which is about when offspring are weaned. So, we've been thinking about this effect quite a bit, and we think that maybe this has to do with accelerated weaning. and potentially how costly this is, whether this has a cost on juvenile survival, even past that takeover phase. And maybe female relationships are buffering that, but we're kind of guessing right now, thinking about this data and how to interpret it. Now, by contrast, when females have a strong relationship with males, okay, so that's that dark green here, their offspring survival, again, in the context of takeovers, is compromised. And this separation actually happens much earlier. Okay, so this suggests that strong relationships with males during takeovers actually makes you more vulnerable. And just to be clear here, he quantified those relationships before the offspring's birth. And this was because he wanted to disentangle cause and effect there. He didn't want to, he didn't want data that would be reflecting females actually becoming more social because they had an offspring, okay? So this is kind of looking at female social relationships generally and how those relationships, even before that infant's birth, might actually impact survival. So it's kind of like an interesting way to look at things. He also then looked at what happens immediately after a takeover. And these data are sparser. They're much harder to link with infant survival, which is why he did them separately. So infant present here, you can sort of interpret that as meaning whether these are lactating females or not. If you looked at proportion of time spent grooming, right, for females with infants, in the post-takeover situation, females start grooming females more, okay? For males, it doesn't matter whether a female has an infant or not. In the post-takeover situation, they're grooming males less, okay? And this is all consistent with some of the data that came out of Chacma baboons. But this suggests, again, that females are renegotiating their social strategies post-takeover to potentially prevent infanticide, mitigate the costs in some way that maybe are not as costly as some of those strategies that involve changing their reproductive physiology. Okay, and on that note, I'm gonna thank everybody in the field. So this is Tori Bergman, Noah Snyder-Mackler, me. Jacinta wasn't there, so I kind of photoshopped her on. This is our team in the field a few years ago, and all of my funding sources, and I will take any questions. Susan, I think you're muted.
Thank you. Renee. Can you hear what Renee's saying? Let me turn this around. Okay, yeah, come up here. Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I thought that was really awesome and interesting. I'm just going to sit here so you can actually hear me.
Okay. Yeah.
Before I ask my actual question, I just wanted to confirm something that I wasn't sure about from your presentation.
Yeah.
So you said that when females have resumed swelling earlier after the takeover, does that mean that they also accelerate weaning, or can they keep breastfeeding while doing that?
Yeah. So first of all, the behavioral nursing data, we don't really know what that means. There's lots of debate over what behavioral nursing actually means and what that means, whether that indicates that they're transferring resources still. The take-home message from the interbirth interval data and the swelling data was that the interbirth interval so if you're an adult female and you happen to experience that takeover when your infant is like, so for Gelada's weaning, let's say weaning is about 18 months. Your kid is like 13, 14 months and the takeover occurs. You immediately produce that swelling. It doesn't seem to do anything to your interbirth interval. So those females take a bit longer to conceive than they usually would. And the net outcome is the same. Their interbirth interval is no different. But it appears that if you are a female that has a very young infant at the time of takeover, let's say they're 3 months, 6 months old, you not only have a harder time producing that swelling, but if you do produce that swelling, you end up having an accelerated interbirth interval too. So this suggests to me that there is some sort of switch, right, that a female has to make. And that if you make that switch early enough, right, it's going to influence things. But if you make the switch later, it doesn't. So I think of it as this. So when we study oval monkeys, often when we look at adolescent females, when they first mature, they have these cycles that are just non-fertile, like they don't work, right? So for months they're ovulating, but like a lot of their cycles are non-conceptive. I think that's what's going on with these guys. It's just that it's so it's like you hit a switch earlier than you would like to, and so it causes you to take a little longer to ramp up. But if you hit that switch really early on, it has an effect. And if you hit that switch later, it doesn't in terms of your interbirth interval. Does that make sense?
Okay, yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I guess, I mean, you're already kind of talking about my next question, which was, so I think you mentioned that moms with younger infants don't resume their swelling as often after takeovers than the moms with older infants, right? And I think you mentioned that as a potential physiological constraint.
Yeah.
I was wondering whether it could be true that the fitness returns of continuing breastfeeding with these infants that still have about 70% chance of survival is simply worth more for females than accelerating weaning on these really young infants.
Yeah, absolutely.
So whether it's really a biological constraint or whether it's a strategy.
I think it's both. Here's my thing is that I feel like lactating females, once they make that decision, since it appears to be real to some extent, they've basically decided that their bodies are going to reproduce now, right? Instead of investing in lactation, for instance, right? And so for them, it's like, what I mean by constraint is it seems as if once you press that button, you can't go back, right? And so obviously for a very young infant, that young infant is still going to be highly dependent on mom, much more so than a 14-month infant, right? A 14-month infant might grow a little slower because of it, but a 6-month infant could potentially die, right?
Right.
So there's that. But on top of it, I would also argue that, those moms are in a really tricky position because the likelihood of dying when you have a young infant, the likelihood of a young infant dying in the context of a takeover is closer to 60%. And that likelihood decreases the older the infant gets. So those moms face the most costs for producing that strategy, but also face the most costs in terms of infanticide. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
So they're in like the trickiest position, right? If you're a female with a fairly older infant, you could just be like, well, I'm going to swell because it's not going to really do a whole lot. It might benefit me, right? It's not going to be that costly. So let's just do it.
Yeah, cool. Thank you so much. And again, I really enjoyed your talk. I thought this was very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See the chat. Oh, Brian. Yes, yeah, come up here.
Hi, Amy. I just want to second what Renee said about your talk. It's been great to hear about your work. You have done so much work on the topic of infanticide and female counterstrategies. I wondered if you could say anything for someone like me who's not as familiar with geladas, anything about the possibility of other kinds of counterstrategies, say, for example, interventions by other females in the group, or even potentially other males. Let's say there's a follower male still in a group that's been taken over.
Yeah.
What can you say about that? I mean, I remember these amazing photographs and stories that Sarah Hurdy would present with her primary work on this topic. Is there scope for that in this study system, and what have you learned about it?
Yeah, we're currently trying to reconcile all the threads that all the graduate students are working on. So Jacinta's got a grad student that works on males, and she's finding in a separate analysis that whether a group has a follower male, that follower male seems to also increase infant survival in the context of a takeover. So right now we're kind of like, okay, how do all these pieces fit? Do we actually have the power to, you know, put them all in a model or not right now? And then I've also, because I study the microbiome, I know it's totally different, but I think a lot about with the microbiome, you know, we talk about like bacteria, like all these different bacteria that could have similar functions. And so a gut community can achieve a certain function with a totally different composition of bacteria than somebody else's. So I've been thinking about that in the context of strategies. And what if, you know, a lot of these strategies, if we just look at them solo, that they're not really doing anything, but if we look at, you know, maybe a female actually tries 5 of these things, right? So this sort of like functional redundancy that together, you know, if we had good data on all these things, maybe the female that does 4 of these things, right, has the best infant survival, right? The sort of functional redundancy of strategies. We see females mobbing, but I haven't seen it. So like witnessing an actual male go after an infant, those are very rare events. We see puncture wounds following takeovers a lot. We've seen a few of those cases. We've seen females mobbing new males just because they apparently don't like that new male. So groups of females can chase a new male down a hill. You know, it's possible. So females, I think, have some agency. We also had a situation where we had a unit of 13 females, and it became 13 because 3 females had just recently matured. We knew immediately that this guy was going to get taken over because 13 females is just, it's, you know, too much of a target out there. And when he did, you know, all the females kind of, you know, literally protected this follower male from the new leader. So females, I think, you know, they're philopatric, they're related. They certainly do have some agency. It's just a matter of maybe whether or not they decide to do it. And I don't know what leads them to make that decision to all band together or not.
Do you have a question? Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Great talk. I was wondering, you had presented some data towards the end of opposite sex interactions decreasing post takeover event.
Yeah.
If I remember
Yeah.
correctly, but
Yep.
previously you had presented data on the impact of same-sex socialization pre-birth on that offspring survival. Do you have any data of opposite sex interaction impacts? And then 2, what is the actual proportion of opposite sex interactions in these populations as like a baseline?
Ooh, I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. To the baseline proportion, I would say a lot less because there's only 1 male and there's several females. I will say that there's a lot of nuance to that data that I did not share, which is that females decrease their interactions with all males, but they increase, well, they start grooming with the follower male, which is the former leader, a lot more. Okay, so that makes sense. Lactating females are following the former leader, right? So they form these little cliques. So especially large groups after takeover, you start seeing them separate out, and you see lactating females with the former leader a lot. But what's so hard is that, you know, there's data. So we know that follower males in general, if they're around following a takeover, they seem to protect the infant. They decrease the risk of infanticide. And yet the kind of long-term baseline social relationship data suggests that if before birth you had a strong relationship with this leader, you're more vulnerable. Right. So that's the part that's really complicated right now. We can't really tease apart. And it's frustrating me because we don't have the data to link what females are doing following a takeover to those outcomes. It's because it's hard to produce social relationships in a time frame that kind of encompasses that immediate time following takeover before an infant dies versus the infants that don't die. It's just a very constrained period of data. And we thought that we could do it, but then when we looked at the data, we're like, this is not possible. right? Because that post-takeover data is really dense, and it all matters if how fast the infant dies, right? If the infant dies within 2 months, you've got barely any social data to link that event with. Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah, we have the same problem with the capuchins. I mean, it can just be a few days, you know, and you can't measure a social relationship adequately in that amount
Yeah.
of time.
And so instead we kind of like dance around it to try to get at it the best that we can.
Yeah, I had a couple of follow-up questions. For one, I was wondering, does the arrival of a new follower male, even if he's being pretty well behaved, not trying to take over, also cause a boost in estrogen, or is it just an actual takeover?
I don't know,
Okay.
because we don't, first of all, there's very rarely an arrival of a follower male. Usually the follower male comes in with like, it's usually like a takeover event where a male comes in
at the
with
top.
another male. Yeah. So follower males are typically like just temporary because of that. So when that new leader finally sort of asserts himself, that follower goes away, right? Or it's a former leader. Those are usually the scenarios. We don't really have like long-term followers that aren't former leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And
yeah, that also reminds me of some of the
Yeah.
capuchin things. So we usually, when there's a takeover at Lomas, it's pretty quick that they revert to, or not revert, but they switch to completely supporting the new alpha. But if it's been a really long-term leader, and we've had alpha males in place for 18 years, which is 3 generations, then they do seem to fight off the new alpha male, and as if they're hoping that this the long-term guy will make a comeback. And then occasionally he will.
Mhm.
But it's really hard to predict. And I always wonder what information the females are using to make a decision about when to just try to hang on there without. We
Yeah.
had one really interesting case in the capuchins where a group of females lost both of their males, and there were many takeover attempts, and they just fought off all of these males and remained an all-female group and saved all of their infants for a
Mhm.
period of approximately a year. And that seemed remarkable to me that they were able to do that, because the males usually are highly successful at killing infants and
Yeah.
taking over. It's really strange. Well, there are
Yeah.
a few more questions in there. Oh, go ahead. Did you have a response to
No, I'm good. I can wait for the next question. Yep.
that? Sally, was it Sally next? Come on up.
Hi,
Hi.
thank you for your talk. I was interested in kind of what you were talking about with Renee, thinking about those mothers with the younger infants, and how you said like that's like the hardest choice, because no matter what, like there's like a chance of death,
Yeah.
either by infanticide or just like malnutrition or whatever. And I was interested in, first of all, like whether you know anything about the mother or the infant that would like determine what choice they made, like whether they stop weaning or not. And then also the way you said choice, I was interested in whether, so like, I guess, yeah, like, do you think it's a conscious choice, or do you think it's like something that's like just like happening through physiology, or would you be able to tell?
I don't think it's a choice, first of all, like in the way humans make choices.
Yeah.
I think it's a physiological mechanism that some females, I don't know if it's an all or nothing game, right? Do some females just react and some females don't? It's probably also based on their condition and where they are, right? I will say, I was talking to one of the graduate students earlier about this, that this response to males, this reproductive response to males, these new males, I think the mechanism involved for lactating females and pregnant females and juvenile females that are maturing is exactly the same mechanism. So what I mean by all or nothing is, are some females just more likely to have this physiological response when a male comes in? And is there a certain amount, for instance, of estrogen, which is what I think it is, that tips certain females over the edge or not, right? So imagine each female they all produce an estrogen surge, which I think Jacinta's working on the hormone data for this right now. So that's the piece that's missing before we publish. Is that maybe for, females with younger infants, either they have a smaller estrogen surge in response to that male, or that estrogen surge just doesn't push them over the edge into cycling. But it's all a shared mechanism. So it could be that what we're looking at, where we're defining as 3 different strategies or 3 different effects, is actually just female responsiveness to novel males. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, it just appears that just like for those 1-2-year-old females that are experiencing that estrogen surge but not maturing, maybe those lactating females with the young infants are experiencing an estrogen surge but not producing that swelling. It's harder for some reason. And I think that there's probably physiological mechanisms involved between, like prolactin and estrogen, or, and also obviously energetic trade-offs. Like, are you allocating life history trade-offs? Are you allocating in, reproducing again, or are you allocating in this offspring? Right. But I don't think it's a choice. I mean, I'm behavioral ecologists are always guilty about framing it that way, but I don't think it's like I want to do this or,
Thank you.
Sasha, you want to come up? Another primatologist coming up here.
Hello. Hi. Thanks for the great talk. I was wondering about the signaling of the swellings, and I know you mentioned that it seems like it's maybe not an honest signal, but more so for the older females. Hopefully I got that right. And I was just wondering if you thought, like, there's this like theory about like costs keeping signals honest, but it also seems like maybe there's this like age effect where maybe if it's honest in the younger females, then that's like enough to keep it persisting. But maybe there's also like, I don't know if you know anything, if there's like a cost to the swelling or returning to swelling that the younger females can't like overcome, but the older females somehow can.
Yeah, I think there is a cost for the older females, but I think it's really small. I mean, at the very least, they're probably investing a little less in their current offspring. But they're not, it's again, it's not like a do or die thing where, if they don't invest in this offspring, it's going to die, right? So the cost is subtle. In terms of signaling theory and signals, sort of having, honest signals being maintained by costs, I haven't thought of it that way yet. But, mostly because the literature, the hypothesis originally was that these were deceptive signals. I think that, so the reason why we frame it the way we do is because Jacinta Biener and I have been arguing about this for like a decade. And she's always like, they're deceptive. And I was always like, I think there's a cost. And like, now we have this data and it's kind of showing us that, there's a cost for these younger guys, but there isn't cost for the older guy, older, for the females with older infants, right? So from my perspective, I think there's a cost regardless. I think there's just a small cost when the infants are older and a very large cost when the infants are younger. And I don't think it's completely deceptive, but the strategy works.
Yeah, I guess the idea would be that the cost keeps it like you can't be deceptive if it's too costly or something like that. But
Right.
yeah,
Right. Yeah.
Thanks.
Any other questions in the room? Okay, so let's see who's got questions on Zoom. Dan Fessler, if resource competition is minimal, female rank has a lesser effect on fitness than infanticide, and larger groups suffer higher for fitness costs from takeovers and attempted takeovers, then why do females stay in large groups?
Right.
Do the data on female-female relationships suggest a possible explanation?
We're not there yet. Are there any benefits of being in larger groups? We haven't found any. We do know that large groups fission. So as soon as they get to that 8 to 10 range, they're more likely to start producing daughter groups. And so yeah, there's a cost to be in large groups, and we think that's why groups break up. So we see a lot of that.
Just to follow up very briefly,
Yeah.
really interesting, and thank you for a great talk. I mean, if that were mitigating and
Yeah.
the system were in equilibrium, then group size would always be perfectly balanced with the infanticide risk, and you'd basically see a relatively homogeneous group size, right? So what is keeping those groups growing beyond the optimal point?
I don't know. We have not, we've looked at the benefits of group size, and we've literally not found a thing. They don't have better interbirth intervals. It's a draw, essentially. They're more vulnerable to takeovers. Infant survival is the worst in large groups and small groups. So they're driving towards medium. The medium-sized group is the modal group size, right? The modal group size is about 5 or 6 females. Groups don't stay at 8 or 10 for very long, right? They fission into groups of 3, 4. But being a small group is horrible too, because you don't actually get takeovers as much. But if you experience a takeover, more of the infants die because there's fewer infants to choose from, I guess. That's the idea. So medium-sized groups have it great. So it's in a female's best interest to be in a medium-sized group, and to have a male that is really strong and can stay tenured for a long time.
Yeah,
And so I feel like, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, maybe when they get beyond the optimal size, it's a game of chicken, right? And each set of females is hoping that some others will leave, and the group keeps growing until it gets obvious that it's now in everyone's interest to split, right?
Yeah, well, we can see that. So Jacob's working on some of this data where he's looking at like pre-fission year and post-fission. And you can see that in the pre-fission year, the cliques are already breaking up into, the females are already separating, right? So how do they make that decision? I don't know, but they start breaking up, and it's usually, females that are more closely related split off. But we've also seen we had a weird fission one year where all the moms went to one group and all the daughters went to another group. So it was like cohort age related fission. And when they break up, they stay in the same area for a long time. So for 2 or 3 years, groups that just recently fission will hang out. And they'll still like sometimes groom each other and stuff. Yeah.
Amazing.
So yeah, there is this mechanism by which they break up. And they seem to be breaking up before, in the year before.
Thank you.
Sasha?
Hi, again, just so following up what Dan said, I was wondering what you think. Well, I guess my impression comparing the group size to most other monkeys in that area of the world, they're actually very small group, right? So there could just be some, right? Like there's some benefits to socializing and having a group in general, but it seems like those are almost the smallest groups you could have with still having like a social life for the females. I mean, if you said 6 and 7 is the modal, that's actually pretty small, right?
It's funny. I don't think so, because I came from studying columbines. I didn't come from studying baboons. So baboons live in groups with, 20, 30 adult females. But if all the animals that I studied have this 2 to 10 females. I think it's pretty common for a animal that primarily has polygynous mating.
Mm-hmm.
So when I think about like baboons, it's mostly multi-female, polygynandrous. There's more individuals, right? There's more females and there's more males. But when there's generally only one male breeding, you're probably not going to have that many females, because again, like polygynous animals that are polygynous are much more vulnerable to infanticide. So all of this is probably related on some level. Someone that is interested in, the evolution of social systems will probably have thought about that a lot more than me. Yeah.
Molly Fox is asking, are these actually false signals or true signals of fecundity? Also, does this species have any shared infant feeding? I'm guessing you mean allo nursing, Molly?
Never seen allo nursing. Are they false or true? I think they're a little bit of both. I lean more towards that they're true. But you know, for some of those females, again, their inner birth intervals that aren't affected. They aren't conceiving right away. So the male seems to maybe get tricked because it works, even though he's not gaining an advantage. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. And I think some of the discussion probably also addressed
Yeah,
my question. I don't want to take too much time because Christine and other students had Andrew, good questions too.
Okay, Christine Chua is asking, I know you spoke a lot of maternal strategies, but I'm wondering if you can speak to potential infant strategies, if any, that you're able to observe during these takeovers that might affect their survival rates.
I don't think infants have strategies. And the reason why I say that is because, I mean, at least behavioral strategies. I've seen infants just like a new male is in the group, and I've seen infants just get in front of that new male and scream its head off. And then you see like the former leader will grab the infant, put him on his back and walk away. I just don't think infants are not that developed, right? They're not really capable of strategizing. Do they have other things that they're doing? I mean, to prevent, I don't think they're doing anything to increase their survival chances. Let's put it that way. Are they responding to that kind of stressful event in any way? You know, some people argue that infants that experience takeover risk have accelerated development, right? That comes out of like the what is it, black and white colobus, that they looked at that. So infants might be kind of changing their life history strategy in response to takeover risk, right? But in terms of preventing or saving themselves from getting killed, I don't see a whole lot of that in terms of me observing what the infants are actually doing in these situations, because they seem to have no clue what a good strategy should be. The juveniles are running for the hills, right? So we often don't talk about juveniles because they're not at risk of getting killed. But when there's a lot of scuffles, they are at risk of getting injured. So juveniles do get injured in these situations. And when you see a takeover, the juveniles have scattered, right? So geladas are a big band. So they could go play off the cliffs far away from their unit if they want. And so whenever you get the aftermath of a takeover, the juveniles, you can't find them. They're gone. So they have strategies.
I just have to ask really quickly, because I know geladas have a lot to say. They're a very vocal species. Capuchins, we have a vocalization that we think is the gargle, which we think is specifically for assessing risk of infanticide that young infants and their mothers do. And then it tapers off, it becomes almost non-existent. Is there anything in the vocal repertoire that could possibly be something like that in geladas?
I don't see anything like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
We've got a question from Andrew Smith. Do you have any data that can speak to whether the likelihood of producing sex skin swellings is conditioned on the sex of the infant? I.e., could the decision-making mechanism make some inductive bets about the likelihood of greater tolerance of female infants as a present future reproductive opportunities for males who are taking over versus male infants?
We have not looked at that. We, in general, have not looked at predictors of the likelihood of swelling. So it's a possibility, but not yet. I also would want to know, for instance, like whether a high-ranking female is more likely to swell when her infants are young because she has better nutrition or something like that. It's just that I feel like that decision only impacts so many females with young infants. So again, like I know we were talking about chunking up this large data set, but now we're really looking at the females with young infants and what they're doing, right? Because they're the only ones that appear to be making that quote unquote decision.
Fernando we've kind of covered this, but he's asking what could be the advantage for females to live in larger groups in which they're more vulnerable to male takeovers if there appears to be no exclusion of groups from resources.
Yeah, I mean, I think they just grow. I mean, you live with your, I mean, we talked about, I think they just, you have daughters, and those daughters have daughters. And at some point you grow from 6 to 9 adult females in a year because there were 3 juvenile females. And at that point, they generally fission in the next couple of years. I think it's just kind of like a stage, you know what I mean? So all these females go through stages where they live in larger groups and then break down. What's interesting is that I think Jacobs looked at this. Females that are generally in larger units generally stay in larger units their entire lives, or for most of their life. So it's not like you go from a unit of 10 females and then all of a sudden for the next half of your life, you're in a group of 2. You know, like you go from 10 to 5 and then grow back up and come back down again. And then we have some units that literally stay at 2 or 3 forever, because I don't know what's wrong with them, honestly, because females, they'll grow to 4 because 2 daughters mature and then they'll die and then be back to 2 or 3. So they're just small.
There are some
so-
interesting papers about group life cycles in capuchins by Charlie Jansen. I don't know if you've seen those, but they're documenting changes in strategies as groups grow, fission, crash, and grow again, and these regularities that are really interesting.
Yeah. So we're looking at that soon too.
Any more questions for within the room? Let's check the chat. Oh, Abby. For females that are part of a large group fission, do interbirth intervals change?
I don't know yet.
Didn't
What?
Dunbar do something like that in Gelada's ancient, decades ago? Maybe I'm wrong, but I seem to remember something like that.
Oh, you mean like right after the takeover, or in large groups, or just in large groups? So there's no effective, like
in-
large groups don't have a different interbirth interval than any other groups. But in the, what happens in like in the 2 years following a fission?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm sure we have the data to look at it, but I don't know off the top of my head.
Molly, did you want to ask your other questions? And we do have a couple more minutes, 10 more minutes, actually.
Sure. I was just curious about, I know you mentioned that you were doing endocrine assays in this next phase, and why you were pointing to estrogen. Is there some sort of a priori reason to think that these processes are governed by estrogen? Could there be a sort of androgenic DHEA kind of component to, viewing it more through the lens of like secondary sex traits and social signaling, or
Yeah.
fecundity itself with progesterone, I was thinking.
In terms of, so the estrogen is just because estrogen's usually mediating these reproductive changes with cycling, with pregnancy, whatnot. I'm sure there are other mechanisms involved, but there are only so many mechanisms we can measure using non-invasive assays on fecal material. The estrogen specifically comes from this kind of creepy mouse study that was done about a decade ago, where they have male mediated maturations called the Vandenberg effect, and also the Bruce effect. So the spontaneous abortion thing in mice, right? That was the first species. So the Bruce effect was documented there, and the Vandenberg effect was documented there. And then about 10 years ago, this guy did an experiment where he radio labeled estrogen, because we know that in lots of animals, estrogen is part of, it influences male reproductive behavior, right? Not just testosterone. And so he hypothesized that estrogen was involved. He injected radio-labeled estrogen into these male mice and exposed them to pregnant and juvenile female mice. And because they're radio-labeled, he can see, you can observe what happens. And then actually, once the animals are dead, you can measure radioactivity in their body to see where it's bound. And what they found was that the radioactivity was found in male urine, and then found in the female reproductive tract and bound there that induce the Bruce effect and the Vandenberg effect. Now, I don't think that the estrogens are coming from the Gelada male. They're so, because they live in these bands, females are exposed to males all the time. I don't see how they would sniff out that male's urine during a takeover, right? That there would be like a new novel male scent or whatever you want to call it. But I do think that estrogen, when you think about, stimulation of cycling, all this stuff, estrogen's got to be involved on some level. Whether there's something upstream involved, I don't know why DHEA would be involved. I know that it's involved in puberty in humans, but we don't know much about DHEA in non-human primates. And plus, like, you can't really measure DHEA very well in a fecal sample and separate it from estrogens or androgens very well. So there's problems with actually even kind of trying to test those hypotheses. I can say that we know about estrogen and we can measure it. I don't know what else is happening. And if we really want to get at the nuts and bolts of this, we'd probably have to test it in captivity. And I don't think that I could experimentally expose any monkey to, this kind of situation to just see what happens, right? So that's a question that I'm okay with not knowing the full answer to, the full mechanism.
Thanks. Can I just ask a quick follow-up, Susan?
Yeah, totally.
Thanks. My boss, Susan. I was just curious also, I think you brought up smell. Like, I was wondering if there are other signals of fecundity, like odor, like behavior, pheromones, that in addition to these swellings that could like create more of a suite of information.
I mean, they're not New World monkeys. They rely a bit less on smell, right? Old World monkeys generally thought of as, relying on much more visual signaling, all these red patches everywhere. I have seen them smell each other, like smelling a female, right? But nobody's ever really gone out to like look at, the chemical signatures out there or anything like that.
In terms of like behavior, like if they're, if these are, say, false signals, would they still be lactating? Like, even if they're able to produce the swellings, wouldn't the male see them feeding, like nursing the infant? Maybe that's a stupid question.
It's not. We actually, so once a kid becomes older than about 12 months, right? The nursing is spotty, right? They're not nursing all the time. So unless you're actually following females and like collecting really like all the time and trying to collect nursing data, you don't really see nursing that often in a focal, right? So whether or not, it's so funny because it's like we collect all this complex physiological data, and then like when it comes to behavioral nursing, I have to say like our data aren't, like good enough, to answer that, because if you just look at focal data, you're just not going to catch it. And then, are they then nursing at night or something? Like, those are things we can't catch. So we originally we actually wrote this giant NSF, and we have isotope data on nursing to get at this question. But again, in the last 3 or 4 years, those takeovers always occurred when we were gone. So we kind of missed. So we have like all this great data on microbiome and isotopes related to like general development, but the takeover data is just not, there's just not enough of it to say anything concrete. So another 10 years, I guess,
Well, thank you.
We have one more question, Fernando Solis. In terms of the experience, cost, and likelihood of offspring survival, what would be the worst reproductive timing for a female to experience a takeover? Probably during early to mid lactation, because she won't be able to invest as much in deceptive counter strategies due to the involved physiological cost.
I would probably say early to mid lactation, yeah. Because if it's pregnancy, and you lose your infant, you haven't invested that much yet. So yeah.
All right, we might have time for one more question. Anyone else have a question they're dying to ask? Any follow-ups? All right, well, thank you so much, Amy, for coming, talking to us. It was a wonderful talk. And thank you to those of you who came in person to make the Beck community a little more alive during this pandemic phase. And yeah, I may follow up with more questions later, Amy.
Sure.
It was really fascinating.
Do you want me to stay on to talk about tomorrow, or am I meeting with anyone tomorrow?
I think pretty much everyone was able to ask questions. When do I do an email poll and ask if we
Okay,
should follow up tomorrow as well?
okay,
Okay,
sounds good. Thanks for having me.
thank you. Bye.